My name is Marisol Delgado. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I believe that if you kept the ledger clean and the receipts filed and the promises documented, the people who loved you would eventually see the math the same way you did. I built an entire career on that belief. I was wrong to think it applied at home. I'd spent 11 years as a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized wealth management firm in Sacramento, the kind of job where people trusted me with numbers they wouldn't say out loud to their own spouses. I could read a balance sheet the way other people read a room. I'd built that skill the hard way, starting as a file clerk at 19, working my way up through 2 certifications and a night school degree while my father, Ruben Delgado, ran his own advisory practice 2 floors below mine in the same building. Close enough that I saw him in the elevator most Tuesdays. Close enough that everyone in that building knew whose daughter I was before they knew anything else about me. My mother had died when I was 26. In the will she left behind, she'd set up a trust in my name. Not a fortune, but enough to matter, funded by a small life insurance payout and a modest inheritance from her own parents. My father was named trustee. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. He was my father. He managed money for a living. It made sense to let him hold the account until I was, in his words, settled enough to manage it myself. I was 26 then. I was 34 now. I had a corner office, a mortgage in my own name, a fiancé named Andres who ran his own contracting business, and I still didn't have access to that account. If you're watching this and there's a question in your own family that nobody's asked in years, because everyone's afraid of what happens once it's out loud, I'd ask you to sit with that for a second before you keep going. I know exactly what that silence costs. I know exactly how long it takes to notice you've been paying it the whole time. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a family once everyone has agreed, without ever saying so, not to ask certain questions. My family had that quiet the way other families have a shared last name. Nobody talked about the trust. Nobody talked about why my father still signed off on withdrawals from an account that had my name on it and hadn't had his for 8 years. We just didn't talk about it. The way you don't talk about a crack in foundation as long as the house is still standing. I told myself it didn't matter. I made my own money. I didn't need his. Andres proposed in March at the overlook above the American River, where we had our first real date, and for about 6 weeks I let myself believe the wedding would be simple. Small guest list, a backyard maybe, or one of the little vineyard venues out past Fair Oaks. I had savings. Andres had savings. We didn't need anyone's help, and that, more than anything, was a plan I was proudest of, a wedding built entirely on what we'd earn ourselves, with nothing borrowed and nothing owed. I should have known my father would find a way to make that not true. In the weeks between the proposal and that first baby shower, Andres and I built our budget the way we built everything together, at the kitchen table, laptop open, 2 coffee mugs going cold between us. We were careful with it. He'd priced out backyard rentals against the vineyard venues just to see the gap, and the gap was a whole point. $40,000, give or take, was what we could spend without either of us touching savings we'd need for a house. We wrote the number on a sticky note and put it on the refrigerator, and for 6 weeks that sticky note felt like the truest thing either of us had ever agreed to. ACT 2, first dismissal. The first sign came at my cousin Teresa's baby shower, 6 weeks after the engagement. In my aunt's backyard in Elk Grove, paper lanterns strung between the fence posts and a folding table of food nobody had labeled correctly for the 2 guests with allergies. It was the kind of afternoon my family did well. Too much food, someone's toddler asleep on a pile of coats in the spare room, my Aunt Rosa running the whole thing like a woman who'd been throwing these parties since before I was born. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. Mostly because it was one of the few family gatherings that didn't have anything to do with my father's office or my father's opinions. My father arrived late, the way he always did anything that wasn't his own event, and made a point of finding me by the drinks table. "So," he said, loud enough for my Aunt Rosa to hear from 3 feet away, "Andres tells me you too are planning something small. A backyard wedding." He said backyard the way other people say garage sale. "We like small," I said. "It's what we want." "It's what you can afford," he said, and smiled like he made a joke instead of correction. "There's a difference, Mija. I just don't want you standing in someone's yard in a dress from a rental shop, because you were too proud to ask your own family for help. People will talk. They'll say the Delgados couldn't manage a real wedding for their own daughter. I felt my face go hot before I found any words. It's not about pride, Dad. It's about doing it ourselves. Doing it yourselves? He shook his head slowly, like I confirmed something he'd suspected for years. You've always thought you had to prove you didn't need anyone. Ever since your mother. He stopped himself, but not because he regretted it. He stopped because Rosa was close enough to hear the rest. And he never finished a sentence like that in front of witnesses. I capped the pen I'd been holding all afternoon, filling out a card for the shower gift table, and set it down beside the guest book before I answered. I didn't say anything else. Not because I'd run out of things to say, but because I'd learned a long time ago that answering him in front of family only ever gave him a second round to correct me in. He stayed another 20 minutes, told 2 different cousins a story about a client he'd helped avoid a tax penalty, kissed Teresa's forehead on his way out, told my aunt the food was lovely, and never once looked back at me. My Aunt Rosa found me by the dessert table a few minutes later, a plate of half-eaten cake in her hand, and gave me the look she always gave me when she'd overheard more than she was going to say out loud. He means it kindly, she said, which was the closest Rosa ever came to an apology on his behalf. In his own way. I told her I knew. I didn't. Not really, not yet. I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel and a headache building behind my left eye. I didn't tell Andres what had happened until 2 days later, and even then, I told it smaller than it had been. He listened the way he always did, patient, one hand on the back of my neck while I talked, and when I finished, he asked the only question that mattered. Do you want help handling him, or do you want to handle him yourself? I told him myself. It was easier, I told myself, than explaining what it actually felt like to be 34 years old and still flinch at my own father's voice. 2 weeks after the shower, my father called to ask if I'd sent him a save-the-date list yet, so he could start thinking about numbers. I told him we hadn't set a guest count. He told me that was exactly the kind of thing he could help with. If I'd let him, I said we'd let him know. I didn't call him back about it, and neither did Andres. And for a while I let myself believe that not calling back counted as an answer. My father built Delgado Advisory from nothing. He started it the year I turned 9, in a rented office above a dry cleaner on Franklin Boulevard, with a card table, 1 filing cabinet, and 11 clients he'd talked into following him from the firm he'd left. My mother worked the front desk for the first 3 years, unpaid, because there wasn't money to pay her and someone had to answer phones. I remember being 10 years old, sitting under that card table with a coloring book while my mother filed paperwork above me, because there was no one to watch me after school and the office was closer than home. By the time I was 14, I was doing real work there on weekends, filing data entry, running documents to the bank 2 blocks over, for $4 an hour, which my father called an allowance with a purpose rather than a wage. I worked most Saturdays for 3 straight years, roughly 150 Saturdays by my own later count, building the same client filing system my father still used a decade later, never once paid above that token rate for it. The second incident I remember more clearly, because it was the one that taught me what my labor was actually worth to him. I was 22, home from college for the summer, and Delgado Advisory was 2 months behind on a compliance audit that could have cost my father his license. I spent 11 straight days rebuilding 4 years of client files from scratch, sleeping maybe 5 hours a night, because I was the only person in that office who understood both the software and what the auditors were actually asking for. I saved that audit over those 11 days, working nights and weekends with no one else in the building. My father took the credit for it in front of the state examiner, calling it a total office effort, without once using my name, and then took me to dinner afterward and told me I'd done all right for a favor. That was the pattern. Once I finally saw it laid out end to end, my labor counted when he needed it and disappeared the moment credit was due. I organized his year-end filing for 6 consecutive years through my 20s, unpaid, calling a helping family, closing out his books every December while I was also closing my own year-end at the firm downtown. I covered his front desk for 4 separate maternity and medical leaves across that same decade, filling in for weeks at a time whenever one of his assistants went out, never once compensated at a rate above what I'd made at 19. I built the digital record system his entire firm still ran on, in a single unpaid summer between semesters, and watched two different employees get raises for maintaining it after I'd left for my own career. There was a third memory, smaller than the audit, but somehow the one that stayed with me longest. I was 26, the year my mother died, and in the 6 weeks after the funeral, I drove to Delgado Advisory every weekday morning before my own job started, answered his phones, rescheduled his clients, and kept his calendar running because he couldn't bring himself to sit at a desk yet, and someone had to. I did that for 6 straight weeks, unpaid, before my own shift downtown, and never once told anyone at my own firm why I kept arriving late. When he finally came back to the office, he looked at the calendar I'd rebuilt for him and said, "See, I knew it would sort itself out." Not thank you. Sort itself out. As if I were weather. None of it was ever named as owed. It was just what a daughter did, the way water finds the lowest point of room, without anyone having to tell it to. By the time I turned 30, I'd stopped keeping a running count in my head of what I'd given that office for free. It felt unseemly, like I was auditing my own family. I told myself it even out somewhere I couldn't see. I felt something close to shame, if I'm honest. Every time I caught myself tallying it up anyway, like gratitude and arithmetic weren't supposed to live in the same sentence. I told Andre some of this, once, early in our relationship, over a kitchen table covered in his blueprints and my spreadsheets. He asked why I'd never billed my father for any of it, even informally, even just to have a number written down somewhere. I didn't have a good answer, because he's my dad, felt true, and also felt like the exact sentence that had let all of it happen in the first place. Andres didn't push. He just started keeping his own quiet tally of the things I did for other people without asking to be paid back, which I only found out about later, when it mattered. The invoice arrived on a Thursday, in an envelope with Delgado Advisory's letterhead, addressed to me at my own apartment. Not a card, not a text. An invoice itemized on the same letterhead I'd once helped design the template for at 19 years old. Venue deposit, Vineyard Estate, El Dorado Hills, $61,000. Catering 140 guests, $38,500. Floral and event design, $22,000. Photography and videography package, $18,500. Attire and alterations, bridal party $9,000. Miscellaneous and contingency, $18,000. Total due, $167,000. Beneath the total, in his handwriting, not typed, "Be grateful you get contribute. This is what family does." I read it 3 times standing in my own kitchen before I understood what I was looking at. He had booked a venue. He had hired caterers. He had, apparently, been planning an entire wedding, my wedding, for weeks, without asking me a single question about a guest list, a date, a dress, a flower, or a single vendor, and had done it all in a size and style Andres, and I had explicitly told him we didn't want. And now he'd send me the bill for it, as though the act of spending money I hadn't authorized on choices I had made somehow obligate me to pay for the privilege of being excluded from planning my own event. I set the invoice down on the counter and picked it back up twice, like reading it a third and fourth time might change the total. It didn't. $167,000, itemized down to the alterations, for a wedding I hadn't chosen a single flower for. I thought about calling Andres first. I thought about calling Rosa. Instead, I stood in my kitchen for a long time doing the kind of math I did for a living, subtracting, cross-referencing, trying to figure out where a man who complained about his own overhead every Tuesday in the elevator had found $167,000 to spend on a wedding he hadn't asked either of us about. My hands weren't quite steady when I picked up the phone. He answered on the second ring, cheerful, like he'd been waiting. "You got the invoice," he said. "I didn't ask you to book anything. You didn't have to ask. That's what a father does." His voice had that particular warmth he used when he was about to say something he considered generous. I wasn't going to let my only daughter get married in someone's backyard like we couldn't afford better. I handled it. All you have to do is pay your share and show up looking beautiful. My share, I repeated. "Dad, I never agreed to any of this. Not the venue, not the guest count, none of it." "You're overreacting," he said, and something in his tone shifted, the warmth cooling into the register I recognized from every argument I'd ever lost to him. "This is what family does for each other, Marisol. We show up. We contribute. Or is that too old-fashioned for you now? Where did the money come from, Dad? I asked. The deposit on the venue. The caterer. $61,000 for a venue alone. Where did that come from? There was a pause on the line, half a second too long for a man who usually had an answer ready before I finished the question. I have accounts, he said. I manage money for a living, Marisol, in case you forgot. That's not an answer. You're twisting this into something it isn't, he said, and I could hear him reaching for the tone he used with clients who questioned his fees, patient and slightly wounded, like the burden of proof belonged to me. I've never once asked you for anything, Marisol, not $1 in 34 years. Do you know how rare that is, a father who never asks his own daughter for money? You didn't have to ask, I said. You had the authority to take it. That's worse. My throat tightened before I found my next sentence, a small closing pressure I had invited and couldn't quite talk myself out of. I'll call you back, I said, and I did something I almost never did with my father. I hung up first. I sat down at my kitchen table with the invoice in front of me, and for the first time in 8 years, I opened my laptop and logged into the online portal for the trust account my mother had left me, the one my father still administered, the one I'd stopped checking years ago because there had never once been anything to check. The portal loaded, and what I saw on that screen told me this invoice wasn't the first time my father had decided, without asking, exactly what my own money was for. The transaction history unfolded down the screen in a column of dates and dollar amounts I had never once been shown. Withdrawal March. For years ago, $9,200. Memo field. Advisory operating shortfall temp. Withdrawal. The following November, $14,500. Memo field. Office lease bridge. Withdrawal. 18 months ago, $15,700. Memo field. Client retention reserve. Withdrawal. This past January, $22,000. Memo field. Vendor deposit. Event services. I sat very still and read the January line 3 times. Vendor deposit, event services, dated 6 weeks before Andres had even proposed. I scrolled back up to the client retention reserve line and tried to remember a single conversation, ever, where my father had mentioned needing a reserve for anything. I couldn't. He'd never asked me for $1 directly in his life. He'd just gone around me instead, for separate times, to a trustee's authority I'd forgotten he still legally held. I called Andres first, not my father, and asked him to meet me at the trust branch office the next morning with his own copies of our engagement paperwork. Then I called the branch manager, a woman named Patricia Hale, who'd handled my mother's estate originally, and asked for a printed transaction ledger going back 5 years, plus a formal accounting of trustee authority under the original trust document. She said she could have both ready by Thursday. Andres met me at the branch the next morning exactly as I'd asked, engagement paperwork in a folder of his own, though as it turned out nobody needed to see it. Patricia recognized me the moment I walked in. She'd sat across from me at 19, the year my mother died, explaining what a trust even was in words simple enough for a grieving teenager to hold on to, and she didn't make me explain twice why I was back. She pulled the original trust document from a records room in the back and read the trustee authority clause out loud to both of us at her desk. Reasonable discretion for account management. No explicit authorization for personal expenditures on behalf of the beneficiary's life events. That last withdrawal, she said, tapping the January line, wouldn't hold up if you contested it. None of these would, honestly, once you look at what they were actually for. She said she'd start the formal accounting that afternoon and asked if I wanted her to flag the account for a trustee review while she was at it. I told her yes before I'd fully decided I meant it. I didn't sleep much between that Tuesday, and the Thursday I drove to my father's office. I kept picturing the conversation different ways, softer ways, ways where he explained it and I understood, and none of this had to become what it was becoming. Andres told me, the night before, that I did on my father a version of the conversation that let him off easier than the facts did. I told him I knew that. I wasn't sure, driving over on Thursday, that I actually did. ACT 5 confrontation. I didn't confront my father over the phone. I drove to Delgado Advisory on Thursday afternoon, the ledger in a folder under my arm, and found him in his office reviewing a client file, tie loosened, looking pleased with himself in a particular way he always did after he decided a problem was already solved. Marisol. He smiled and gestured at the chair across from his desk. Come to talk about the wedding? I already put down a deposit on the floors, so we should move fast on. I have a question about the trust, I said, and I stayed standing. January of this year, $22,000 withdrawn under your authority as trustee, memo field, vendor deposit, event services. What event, Dad? His face didn't change immediately. That was the part one remembered afterward most clearly. How long it took for anything to move, like he was doing math behind his eyes and hadn't landed on an answer yet. That was administrative, he said. Trustee discretion covers reasonable management expenses. It's dated 6 weeks before Andres proposed. I set the folder on his desk and opened it to the ledger page, laying it flat so the highlighted line faced him. You booked my wedding before I was engaged. I was being prepared, he said, and something in his voice sharpened, the warmth curdling fast now that the room wasn't full of witnesses to perform for. Someone in this family has to think ahead. You've never once thanked me for handling things before they became your problem. It's my money, Dad. My mother left it to me. You've been drawing from it for 4 years to fund your own office and now my wedding, without telling me once. And then you sent me an invoice for $167,000 asking me to pay you back for spending money that was already mine. You wouldn't have a business to inherit from me at all if I hadn't kept this family afloat, he snapped, standing now, both hands flat on the desk. Everything I've done for this family, for you, and you're standing here with a folder like I'm some kind of criminal. There's a third withdrawal, too. I said, 18 months ago, $15,700, memo field client retention reserve. What client, Dad? Name one. He didn't answer that either. My stomach dropped the way it does when a number on a screen confirms something you'd already half known and hoped you were wrong about. I folded my hands in front of me and said nothing for a moment, letting the silence sit in the room the way he never let it sit for anyone else. I brought Patricia Hale's card, I said finally, sliding a second sheet across the desk. She's already flagged the withdrawals for review under the original trust terms. I'm not here to yell at you. I'm here to tell you I'm filing for a change of trustee, effective this week, and I've asked her to begin a formal accounting of every withdrawal going back to the trust's opening. You do that to your own father, over money. You did it to your own daughter first, I said, for years ago. He didn't have an answer for that one. He sat back down, slowly, and reached for the ledger like he needed something to hold, and I watched him read the January line again, this time like it belonged to someone else. I left the folder with him. I didn't need it anymore. Patricia had the original in the branch office, and mine had only ever been for this conversation. I told him he'd hear from Daniel Okafor's office within the week, and that I'd let him know if the accounting turned up anything he needed to respond to formally. He didn't walk me out. I let myself out through the same door I'd let myself in through as a 19-year-old file clerk, past the same reception desk, past a framed photo on the wall of my father and 11 clients standing outside the old office above the dry cleaner, and I didn't look back at it the way he never looked back at me. ACT 6, Aftermath/Exit Statements. We had Thanksgiving at my Aunt Rose's that year, the way we always did. My father showed up late, the way he always did, though this time he sat mostly quiet near the end of the table, instead of holding court at the head of it. Patricia Hale's formal accounting had gone through by then, a full itemized report showing $61,400 drawn from my trust over 4 years without my knowledge, including the January wedding deposit, and a new trustee, a court-appointed fiduciary named Daniel Okafor, had taken over the account 2 weeks earlier. My father hadn't spoken to me directly since the meeting in his office. The table that year was smaller than usual. My cousin Teresa was there with her new baby, and even she'd gone quiet, watching my father the way you watch whether you're not sure is finished passing. Nobody had explicitly told the rest of the family what happened between January and November, but families find out anyway, in pieces, through the people who can't help repeating things. It was Rosa, of all people, who made space for it. She caught my eye over the pie course, glanced once at my father, and said, "Marisol, Is there anything you want to say? The way she always used to when we were kids, and something needed clearing before dessert. I set my fork down and looked at him. You told me at Teresa's shower that people would say the Delgados couldn't manage a real wedding for their own daughter. I said, I've thought about that line a lot since January. While you were saying it, you already spent $9,000 on my mother's trust on your office lease the year before, and you were 6 weeks from booking a florist with the rest of it. You weren't worried about how the wedding would look. You were worried about how you'd explain where the money went. I was standing there planning a backyard wedding on my own savings, the whole time, having no idea I was already paying for the one you decided to have instead. The table had gone quiet. My father didn't look up from his plate. You told me on the phone that this is what family does. We show up, we contribute. During the 11 days, I rebuilt your compliance files at 22, sleeping 5 hours a night to save your license. You told the state examiner it was a total office effort and never said my name once. I know now that showing up was always something I did for you. It was never something you did for me. And you wrote on that invoice, be grateful you get to contribute. I've been contributing since I was 14 years old, filing papers in your office for $4 an hour. I contributed every year-end close for 6 years, unpaid. I covered your front desk through 4 leaves nobody else wanted to cover. I was never late to pay my share of this family. You were 4 years late paying me back for mine, and you never once planned to. He finally looked up. His eyes were wet, though he didn't let it go further than that, and for a long moment nobody at the table moved. I don't know how to be the kind of father who doesn't fix things, he said quietly. I don't know how I got here. You got here the same way every time, I said, by deciding first and telling me after. The trust, the audit, the wedding. It was never that you didn't love me, Dad. It's that you never once thought loving me and asking me were the same thing. I don't need you to fix things, I said. I needed you to ask. I didn't wait for an answer. I picked my fork back up, and after a moment, so did everyone else, and the conversation moved on the way conversations do at family tables, carrying the weight of what had just been said, without anyone needing to name it again. My father left before dessert was finished, quietly, the way I once used to leave rooms myself. Andres and I got married the following June, in the backyard of a friend's property outside Fair Oaks, exactly the way we planned before anyone else decided to plan it for us. 60 guests. A rented arch draped in the flowers I'd chosen myself. My father wasn't on the guest list, not out of spite, but because by then neither of us had the heart to pretend the last year hadn't happened. Rosa walked me down the aisle instead, and cried more than I did. Teresa's baby is walking now. Rosa still throws the same kind of parties, too much food and paper lanterns, and a toddler asleep on a pile of coats somewhere in the back of the house. And I go to all of them, and my father doesn't, mostly, unless Rosa specifically asks him to and specifically tells him to behave. The building on Franklin Boulevard where the dry cleaner used to be is a nail salon now. Delgado Advisory moved to a smaller office 2 years ago, after he lost a few of his older clients, though nobody in the family says out loud why. The trust is fully mine now, managed by Daniel Okafor until I decide I want to take it over myself, which I might someday, once I've made my peace with what that account has come to mean. My father and I speak sometimes, briefly, mostly through Rosa, mostly about nothing that matters. I don't know if that changes. I've stopped needing it to, on any particular schedule. I let myself feel hurt about it. Finally, somewhere around Christmas, sitting alone in the house Andres and I bought that fall. Not angry. I've been angry for months by then, and anger was almost easy, a number I knew how to hold. This was different, quieter, and it took me longer to name it than it should have. I was hurt, plainly, the way a kid is hurt, that the person who taught me how to read a ledger had never once wanted to see mine. I think about that word a lot now. Contribute. He used it like a debt I owed for existing in his family, when the truth was I've been paying into that account, in labor and hours and unpaid Saturdays, since I was 14 years old. I didn't need him to hand me anything. I needed him to stop taking and to ask, just once, before he decided what my life was for. Andres kept the old sticky note from the refrigerator, the one with our first budget written on it in his handwriting, and had it framed for our first anniversary, instead of anything more expensive. It hangs in our hallway now, $40,000 in blue ballpoint, next to nothing else. Sometimes I catch myself doing the math on it anyway, out of habit. What $167,000 could have bought instead what $40,000 actually did. And every time, the second number wins by a wider margin than the first one ever could have. It wasn't really about the venue or the florist or even the money in the end. It was about being asked. $40,000 we chose ourselves turned out to be worth more than 4 times that spent by somebody who never once thought to check with me first. I don't know if every family has a version of that invoice. The moment where love and money get handed to you in the same envelope. And you finally have to decide which one was ever real. But if you got one sitting in a drawer somewhere unopened, I hope you open it before it's 4 years old instead of 1 week. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental. If this one hit home for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.